Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. Today, I'm with the one and only R.F. Kuang, who is the author of the Poppy War trilogy. Rebecca is an award-winning author, and the last book in the entire trilogy, The Burning God, comes out this November. So be sure to keep your eyes out for that. So thank you so much for being with me today, Rebecca.
Thanks for having me.
So quickly before I dive in, I wanted to plug a little really quickly that I will be giving away a copy of The Burning God. So if you want to enter, just either comment your favorite character in the Poppy War trilogy and also comment your Instagram or Twitter handle so that I can contact you if you're randomly selected as a winner. And this is an international giveaway, so everyone's welcome to enter.
Wow, that's so exciting.
I know, I'm just really excited. I'm like, everyone needs to read this. It's so good.
I've also been trying really hard to make sure that all my giveaways are international, since I've heard back from a lot of readers who are often not in the US or the UK, and they're like, books are really expensive and difficult to access where I live. So I've been trying to be more cognizant of that, since even though like shipping is a little more expensive, but
I think they
it's okay, it's worth it.
so much more though. It's so good to especially because this is a book that many Asian readers have resonated with. I think it's really important for them to be able to access it.
Yeah.
So jumping right into the first question, how does it feel to be done with the Poppy War trilogy? Are you excited? Are you nervous? Are you sad to part with the characters? And if you are, do you have any advice for us fans who are really sad to let everyone go?
Well, honestly, it's been a process. I don't want to say a mourning process, more like a not a grieving process, just a growth process. Because my attitude towards finishing changed a lot since when I actually turned in the last draft, and like all like the little bits of work I've had to do on it since. So the last major revision I did was back in March. Actually, I turned it in right before COVID got really, really bad in Oxford. So like that was done, that was out of the way. I didn't have to focus on it. And I sent it off to my editor, and I just felt like there's this huge weight off my chest, and I felt really relieved and happy because I'd been working on it at the same time that I was in classes, and it was just like this big ball of stress weighing on me constantly. And I was like, yes, that's done, the trilogy is over, I don't have to worry about it anymore, I'm free to just like spread my wings and work on the next project, which I'd been dreaming about and been excited about for such a long time. But then as like the weeks progressed after I sent in that last revision, I started struggling a lot with just thinking like, oh man, I miss writing these characters. I miss writing within this world, and so like this storyline and these plot lines, like I dreamed them up like 5 years ago, right? And I've been working with the same characters for like the span of time between I was 19 and now when I'm 24, and like starting over on the Oxford novel, which is the next big thing I'm working on, it was like really weird and scary because suddenly I had new characters, a new plotline, a new world. And not only was world building really difficult, because like writing books 2 and 3 in a trilogy are so easy from a certain perspective because you don't have to like make up the building blocks of the world anymore. Like you know exactly what's happening and what's like where everybody is and what everybody's like and what their voices sound like, etc. So I'd gotten so used to just sitting down to write and being like, yep, it's a Nezha scene, hate him, arrogant asshole, like he and Rin are gonna argue, he and Kitay are gonna argue, it's gonna be loaded and there's gonna be chemistry and it's gonna be cute. And like it's like it was all built into like my muscle memory writing, right? But then when I started working on the Oxford book, like it was all new characters and new worlds, and like it was 1830s Oxford, and I've never done anything in the Victorian era before. So there's just a lot of research involved, getting to know the new characters, and at the same time, I was struggling with letting go of the ghosts of my old characters. Like I would write from my new main character's perspective, and then like Rin's voice would come through, and she'd be like, burn them, I hate them, and I'd be like, no, we're more reasonable in this novel. Like everyone's a bit nicer. So it's been difficult, just because I've been gotten used to writing in a certain mode for so long, and now I have to relearn a lot of things. But I recently did a chat with V.E. Schwab where I asked her how she moved on from her trilogy, and she said one thing that really helps is changing one thing like structurally, like the voice or the POV or the tense, etc. Just like one big craft thing to make it sound completely different. And that is what I've done for the Oxford book. And I won't say what yet in case it doesn't work out. But it feels like a new enough, like exciting project that I'm able to shift and adjust totally to it. But I'm still not totally able to let go of the characters, which is why I guess I'm working on all this like Nezha bonus content stuff.
So thankful for that
like
book.
it does. I'm actually still not quite sure. I haven't started writing it yet because I have until November, and I'm still not quite sure which scenes I want to do because some scenes are like really spoilery, and then other scenes are like so fraught and require a lot of backstory. Like I would love to do the end of the Dragon Republic, like that famous scene, but I think that would just be really difficult. So I'd like to do maybe a scene that perhaps wasn't such a big deal from Rin's perspective, but is a big deal from Nezha's perspective. And I don't know what yet, but we'll see. And that's my way of like easing out of the trilogy. Like I get this one last treat and then I'm done.
Would you ever want to go back and do like a novella for any of the characters? Or are you just like yeet them into the wind?
I've thought about this. So I know definitely as a reader when I'm finishing or when series that I really love are concluding, like I always have this sense of heartbreak and I'm like I wish the author would just write like little bits involving the characters or just like revisit the world in any way, shape, or form. But actually, like as a reader growing up, I've always been a little disappointed whenever the author did that. So Harry Potter is a very fraught fandom to have once participated in now, and I can't say I would read or purchase or enjoy any new Harry Potter content coming out, but I definitely remember like after the seventh book, right? I just like felt the sense of loss and I wanted more, and I was like, J.K. Rowling, please like write any other Harry Potter book. And then like The Cursed Child came out and I read the script and I was like, but this isn't what I wanted, because what you really want is not just more with the characters, but more in a plot where like the stakes feel real, where they're fighting for something. And now that like the main storyline of the Poppy War has concluded, like I'm not really sure what I would do with the characters, right? And I always think like prequel content is a little bit disappointing also because the prequel content can't deal very much with the storyline in the original trilogy without like messing up with those timelines. So like I could do a psych novella, but like it wouldn't be able to get into the heavy stuff. So I don't feel a strong urge to do anything more in the world now. There's a world in which like the series like gets so overwhelmingly popular, and I'm like, I want to make a lot more money. I'm gonna write like the oh man, I can't say it. It's a spoiler. But like right, there's like a Legend of Korra version of like what happens 50 years after the end of the Burning God, but that would require like just so much more thought and consideration because like that's huge, like that's a huge world change, right? Like I really don't know where we go from there.
And mine can't
So,
even comprehend
we'll
that. That just like out there, but so like I want to read that. That
oh
sounds
my god, I very nearly just spoiled the Burning God. But yeah, I think it'd be interesting to ask like what that world looks like 20, 30, 40 years down the road. And I have no idea, but that might be a fun project to work on one day. But for now, I'm at peace with the characters. I don't think I'll produce any new content, and you're just gonna have to fall in love with the Oxford characters if you want more from me.
so. Would your advice for readers like come to terms with how the Burning God ends and make peace with it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or write fan fiction. Go read fan fiction. I can't read fan fiction for legal reasons, but I've heard there's some good stuff on AO3.
I've heard one of my friends like tries to like look it up and said we just need more Poppy War fandom content. Whatever it is, we just need more fandom content.
Yeah, ooh, there is a cool project that has not been announced yet that has a lot of gorgeous art content that I've been working with the artist on and like consulting and giving feedback on like the composition of certain scenes. And I've just seen one of them and it blew my mind with how pretty it is. And I've seen a sketch of another and it made me cry. So whenever I think that's being announced in September, but they really will kill me if I say anything more about it.
I'm just seeing any art for the Poppy War just makes my heart so happy.
Me too. I feel like I've really been blessed with fan art, like especially recently, because I think the third book is going to come out, so a lot more people are picking up the first book, and it's been so great. It's also gorgeous.
We love to see it. Okay, so moving on to like a more serious question. So what has your experience been like in the publishing industry, specifically within sci-fi fantasy, where historically the genre has been more like white and male dominated? I think a lot of people who saw your speech for like the Hugo Awards was able to resonate a lot with it, and I don't know, really just felt something.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I definitely got a lot of feelings off my chest with the Astounding Awards speech, but I do think that speech was a little too pessimistic because a lot of people have reached out afterwards and asked, like, then what in the industry makes it worth staying? And I think there's a lot that makes it worth staying. And the first thing is that marginalized authors, especially BIPOC authors, they really come out for each other. So the reason why I felt at home in the industry and why I felt like I have the courage to go forward and deal with my publisher or deal with my editor or, deal with a bunch of other people whom I've experienced like racism, sexism from, etc., were because there were older, right, like Asian diaspora writers who took me under their wing and walked me through like their experiences. And yeah, we really come out for each other. Like, so Fonda Lee, for example, she was my mentor through the SIFA mentorship program, and she like held my hand through a lot of issues. Like, I was like, oh man, I don't know if I can finish this book by like the contract deadline. Like, I don't know what to do. And she was like, look, like white male fantasy writers get their deadlines extended by like years and years. You're asking for a couple months, you're gonna be fine. And I asked for a couple months and I didn't end up being fine. And just like there's so many people like her, and I think that's why it makes it so important to pay it forward and always look out for newbie writers. So that's just like a beautiful, wonderful thing about the community that makes it worth staying, that I really hope BIPOC writers who are just starting out know about, because it's not all sunshine and roses, but it's not terrible either. The other thing that's not so optimistic though is I think that the industry really needs to have a reckoning with sexual harassment of younger writers. Because when the Poppy War was just about to come out, like I wasn't even 21. I couldn't drink yet, right? I was an undergrad and going to cons and stuff, and I have not been to a single convention except for WizCon since I was 19 where I haven't been sexually harassed in some way, shape, or form. And I don't know if this is an industry issue or just an issue with like all industries generally, but people like treated me in ways that were really inappropriate. Like this one person like followed me, like got out of the elevator at a con and followed me down the hallway and like shouted after me like, you're so beautiful. And like somebody else, like, no, I was so young at this time, and like people who are like 10 years, 20 years older than me were like texting me things that were really uncomfortable. Last year at Worldcon, like somebody was touching my front, like, and that was the first time I ever had the courage to actually say something about it. And I went to the con committee and reported them and had like the con bring them in and give me an official apology. But they were like touching me and saying things that were super racist about like how my red dress looked really good against my yellow skin. And that was like my first Worldcon ever. And I was up for the Astounding Award, and it was supposed to be like the best weekend ever. And it completely ruined my con because I had to spend the whole next day like sitting with the con committee and telling them what had happened and filing an incident report and like needing support the whole time and basically like being in tears. So it really, really sucks, right? If you're young in particular, if you're a woman in particular, and these guys just get away with it and nobody ever talks about what they did, or if they did, like it's only a certain subset of people who think it's wrong, and they just keep showing up in convention spaces, winning awards, publishing books, etc. And that's something I really don't know what to do about. Like I think the only thing again is whisper networks that are really effective. Like I've known to avoid a lot of people because people warned me about them, and I have since warned other people about people who've done bad things to me. So there's all the bad stuff that happens, but there's also like the wonderful supportive community that protects you from a lot of it and supports you through it, even if you underwent it. So it's good and bad.
I'm so sorry to hear about that experience, and not just like even it being an isolated incident. That's terrible, and it really shouldn't happen to any young woman or any like author with those types of spaces. And like you said, they show up again and again, and I'm so sorry for that.
I mean, it's incredibly frustrating. I'm over Worldcon because it was over a year ago, but it was very upsetting when it happened. But now I'm like, like we're moving on. We're not thinking about that anymore. But yeah, I mean, the sad thing is though that I can't even say that this is an issue with publishing. It seems to be an issue in academia, in gaming, and any other creative industry. It's just pervasive and widespread. And like, Me Too was a cultural moment and people were speaking out, but I haven't really seen like structural institutional changes that happen as a result of that. And I think it's going to take a much larger cultural shift for that to become like complete non-problem. So, we'll see what happens. But I mean, the good thing is that we are good at supporting each other, and that's what I cling to.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you have a support network. You're also being that mentor to younger writers as well. I sincerely hope that the industry can make some big changes eventually, or not even eventually, just sometime soon, because that's just inappropriate.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the best way that we can get back at, predators in the industry when the industry refuses to kick them out is to just write really good books and crowd them out of the market and, succeed on our own terms. So we don't need them. We don't need their recognition. We don't need to be in the same con space as them because younger marginalized writers are writing really good stuff, and there's a large audience out there for this stuff because people really want to read those diverse voices. So, there's a space for our voices, and we're being celebrated, and we're celebrating each other, and that's all that matters in the end.
Yeah, I think even just your book and just you as a person in general, you have done so much for the Asian community and just female readers in general. We really look up to you, and your book in particular just speaks on so many important themes. Through Venka's story, we get to see that sexual assault and how you move past that. And even in books 2 and 3, so kind of moving on to the next question, you talk a lot about Western colonialism within the Dragon Republic and the Burning God through the Hesperians. So I guess with the industry itself, because it can be a certain way, have you received any kind of conflict or backlash from the way you've painted the Hesperians in particular?
So I actually haven't gotten hate for how the Hesperians are so racist, because at that point it's you have to be really crazy to think oh no, colonialism and imperialism were totally okay. I think so. I have an interesting anecdote about The Burning God when it was going through edits. And in the original outline that I turned in, there weren't a lot of direct confrontations with Hesperians because I was more interested in the civil war going on and Rin's own actions. But then my editor, who is white, wrote me a piece of feedback that was I don't really get Rin's motivations anymore. We don't really understand what she's fighting against. And it just seems like she's super evil and being super cruel. The reader is not on her side anymore. And that was a huge wake-up call to me, because I realized that for the average reader, or the reader who resembles my editor, for example, the abstract concept of colonialism or imperialism, etc., is just it's not that they don't think it's bad, but they're just unless I'm seeing viscerally on the page the horrors of white people coming in and forcefully converting natives, etc., they don't understand why that's bad. So then I had to go in and write Hesperians firebombing children to be it is really bad. They do these things because I study Chinese history and Chinese literature, right? And I am entrenched in literature about colonialism, post-colonialism, etc. These are just fundamental truths to me. But a lot of readers who are not familiar with this literature or this history, even though they would call themselves anti-racist, even though they would say, oh yeah, I totally don't agree that colonialism is bad. A lot more work has to be done in text for them to understand why certain movements or certain forms of cultural or military incursion are bad. So I think that this relates to a larger conversation about how books by marginalized writers, by POC writers, writers from non-Western cultures, etc., are reviewed, because I think a lot of the historical struggles about against imperialism, etc., a lot of reviewers don't really get it or understand why they're so fraught or understand why the protagonists are fighting for the side that they are. And I mean, that's just a larger complaint about, I think, readers reading books out of context and not understanding the cultural context and milieu that they're written within. But, that's getting away from the question.
Yeah, definitely. I think especially as someone who is Asian, someone who is a POC, you get to reading the Dragon Republic for the first time and getting to read the scenes where the white man isn't the idealized version of humanity and isn't the greatest godlike figure was kind of refreshing.
So I was in a really good panel at Worldcon a couple of years ago about writing the other, and I believe K. Tempest Bradford and Nisi Shaw were also on this panel. But one really good point they made was when you are writing somebody who's like, not like the default white protagonist, one really interesting way to world build and reinscribe those differences is to describe white people from their point of view. So you make the default culture seem other. And like when you start doing that, like a lot of like spaces open up for interrogation of our like dominant assumptions when we approach a text. So for example, when Rin meets white people for the first time, she's like, they're so ugly. Like their skin looks so weird. Their eyes are creepy to me. Like they're tall, but I don't get them. They smell bad. And I mean, this is how other cultures and other races are described in fiction by white people all the time. They're barbaric, they're short, their eyes are strange looking. And it's like, okay, how would you feel if people described white people that way? So that's something that I had a lot of fun doing with the Dragon Republic, just like flipping the colonialist script on its head.
It was such like a refreshing change of pace in terms of like the books that people like to read.
So yeah, it was just really funny to write.
Yeah, I was really surprised to hear like people didn't react poorly to that, because I feel like sometimes people might get defensive.
I think that if you liked my work enough to read the second book, then you're not going to have too much gripes with the politics in the second book. Like, I think like most people who are like, we're not on board with you and your agenda would have just like DNF'd the first book and not moved on to the Dragon Republic. So I think that also has to do with my not getting very much negative feedback about the white people.
But they should read it. They should like confront and just see this other perspective. So moving on to the next question. So while Rin and Nezha's relationship can be interpreted as romantic, so a lot of people like to talk about like Rin Nezha, you make it a priority to not highlight a central romance in the book. So within that, we like to, like a few of my friends talked about how sometimes even though romance isn't a central part to the story, the fandom and sometimes authors like to hint at it a lot to kind of capitalize on that romance. So was there a specific reason why you chose to like exclude that specifically from the book?
Yeah, I'm going to take out my earrings because I think they're clacking against my AirPods and it's annoying me. But yes, there are two main reasons for this. The first is that I just am not very good at writing romance. And I think like we tend to write what we read the most, and we tend to write like the authors that we really enjoy. And like tons of my friends really, really enjoy romance novels or fantasy novels with like a strong romantic like main plot, and I bounce off of that so hard. I hate it. I can't get into it. I don't know why. Like it's not like I hate like romance generally. Like I feel like I'm a very romantic person with my boyfriend, but I have no patience for it in fiction. So I never learned how to do it properly, like write like kissy scenes or the evolution of a dating relationship. Like I don't know how to do that, frankly. And that's related to my not being able to write romance scenes because I'm scared that my parents are going to read them and make fun of me for them. Because like my dad studied physics during his PhD, and so in the first book, right, when I'm talking about ki and the dispersion of force and how the martial arts work, he would text me and be like, so this is wrong, and force like you cannot like redirect force this way, and also there are all these other inaccuracies in which you've described like bodies in motion, and I was like, okay dad, and like every time I describe things like food or like Chinese terms for things, etc., like he's so harsh on me, and he's just like, nope, don't like this, don't like that, you have to change this. So like, can you imagine, right? And he like really likes to comment on the plot lines and the character relationships, etc. So can you imagine me writing like a sex scene and then my dad reading it and being like, so I don't think that he could have flipped her over in this way. That does not seem right to me. It seems to take too long. In my experience, it would not take, like, that would be so embarrassing. So I could never do that. Like, I think that even when I'm 40 and as long as my parents are still reading my books, I still will not write any romance scenes because I'm just like too squicky and weird about it. But I mean, the second reason for not including a strong romantic subplot is just because, like, I think in some cases it can really take away and it's unnecessary for the main plot. And like at a certain level, right, like if you try to fit too many things into a story, it feels crammed or cramped rather, and it feels like you're not devoting enough like prose to each theme that you're trying to articulate. And like this is at its base a story about war, about possible alternate futures of China, about the rise of communist movements in response to Western imperialism right after World War II, and the values clash that happened as a result. So I don't think that I could have worked like a romantic subplot in well and also had time to deal with all the rest of the stuff. So I'm trying very carefully to say that it's not like I think that romance is a bad thing for books to be about. Obviously, like, you know, tons of people love romance. It's a perfectly valid genre. And like there are fantasy books that deal with a lot of this other stuff that also have like really great romantic subplots. But I just happen to be one of the readers who doesn't have patience for it and one of the writers who does not have the skill to do it. So I mean, like Rin and Nezha's relationship, yes, it's romantic in a sense, but I think actually what I was trying to accomplish there was chemistry, right? Because like their binary opposition, like their like totally different like ideological stances and backgrounds and everything that they stand for, etc. Like there's so much tension because they are such direct opposites. So like of course there's going to be chemistry between them, just because of that push and pull and like, you know, opposites attract, etc. But that's not because I want them to end up together, but rather like I want to see what happens when they butt heads.
Yeah. Did you always intend for that to be the case for Rin and Nezha to be the ones who were kind of the polar opposites versus Kitay, who's more of like the platonic friend on the side, who's there to help out Rin, but also be the voice of reason?
Oh yeah, so Rin and Nezha are always going to be like diametrically opposed foes, and you know there's so much symbolism that goes into the relationship: yin yang, the dragon and the phoenix, etc. Fire and water. Like I could not have like clubbed readers more in the head with the symbolism with those two. But I love the Kitay question, and a lot of people have like. So initially, some people were shipping Ren and Kitay, and I was like, "Oh, that's weird. Like that just feels so wrong to me." Um, but I mean, I get how you could think that that could possibly be a relationship if you've only read like maybe the first half of the Poppy War, because it's like, oh, there's a love triangle. There's like the mean rich boy and like the nice smart boy, and who's her best friend, and she's gonna end up falling for her best friend. But man, I really don't like those storylines. But also, I think it's like it's fairly rare for fantasy novels to have like a male and female friendship where it never becomes like remotely romantic or sexual. Like they don't have like angst about their feelings for each other ever, which I find like it's sometimes really tiresome. And I just want to be like ride or die best buddies. Like I'm here for you. Like, you know, we're together to the end of the line, etc. Like they have the best friendship in the entire trilogy, and I'm really glad that it's never complicated or changed by any romantic undertones.
I love that. I want to ask about Burning God, but I don't want to get into spoilers. Yeah. So moving back a little bit towards your Oxford novel that you were talking about, since it's set in London, do you plan to like have any Asian inspiration in terms of history, like going into that? I know you've talked in the past about how it's going to be about like student protests, kind of students versus the government. And as a follow-up question to that, will you ever want to go back to writing an epic fantasy?
Yeah, so okay, I'll take those questions in
Sorry,
parts.
I threw a lot at you.
Okay, so the first question, Asian inspiration in 1830s Oxford. And yes, absolutely. I think you cannot write about the colonial period without also writing about India, without writing about China, and also writing about the slave trade, right? Like, and I feel like my great frustration with a lot of Victorian novels written oftentimes by white people is that they have an entirely white cast. Maybe there's a black servant there somewhere, but and they're drinking tea from India, they're using porcelain made from China, etc. Like they're wearing cotton prints that come from India, right? And they never talk about how, for example, the rich white dudes are making their money or where all these goods are coming from, etc. And it's like the entire life of the average like middle class like rich protagonist in a Victorian novel is steeped in colonialism, relies on the slave trade, etc. And you know, none of this is ever discussed. Like all of the people of color working to make these lives happen are off page and off screen. And so for the Oxford novel, I really want to interrogate that. So of the four main characters, only one of them is white, and the other three, one is from Canton, the other is from Calcutta, and the third is from Haiti. So it has allowed me, and like obviously this was at a time when students of color were not admitted to Oxford, but in my version of Oxford they are, although for this is a spoiler, so I won't explain why students of color are sometimes allowed to study at Oxford, but they're there, right? And their immediate presence on the page allows us to deeper interrogate the colonialist underpinnings that make life at a largely white institution like Oxford possible. So it's a lot of fun, and like it deals so much with the history of like, you know, the colonial trade between India, you know, producing opium being shipped to China, where they would acquire silver and bring back to England, etc. So like it's all interconnected, but that's not how they teach history. They teach history as white, like Victorian England, and then the rest of the world. But white Victorian England was only made possible because of exploitations going on all over the globe.
I'm so excited. The more you talk, I want to read it now.
Oh, it's been a lot of fun to write, but like because it deals with so many cultures, and like they're like most of the characters have backgrounds that aren't Chinese, but they also aren't white, which means that I have to, you know, take on a lot of responsibility to do my research to make sure I'm representing those characters accurately, etc. Like I've never written like, you know, a brown character before, a character from India, and his name is Ramiz at this point, but that might change. But you know, Ramiz is Muslim, he's Bengali, and you know, I share none of those identities, so I've had to rely on like people who do share those identities to like teach me and you know, make sure I'm not representing them in a way that could possibly be harmful to readers. So it's going to be a lot harder to write, but I think ultimately it's going to be worth it, because I also just don't think it's possible, right, to write about 1830s Oxford without also talking about Calcutta. And you also can't talk about 1830s Oxford without talking about the slave trade, because even though slavery was technically abolished in England in 1833 or whatever, like that doesn't mean that people weren't still profiting off of the slave trade. That didn't mean that, you know, in the Americas particularly, like slavery wasn't still happening. So like there's just such a burden of representation if you're going to talk about the exploitations of colonialism in a place like Oxford. But you know, like I'm ready for a much harder project, so there we go.
It sounds a lot more complicated, but also so much more exciting, or not so much more exciting, but just as exciting to read about. Do we have
I think it's gonna be good.
Do you have like an anticipated release date, or is that like completely not considered yet?
So if everything goes well, it's supposed to come out in 2022. My deadline for it is next summer, and you know, like unless like something terrible happens and my editors hate it and I have to do a ground up rewrite, like hopefully the book comes out in 2022.
All your fans are rooting for you. We're very excited.
I'm like, I've written 110,000 words of it already, which is crazy. I feel like I've been very productive during COVID actually, which I feel lucky for. But yeah, it's going really well so far. So we'll see what happens. Then your next question is, will I write epic fantasy again? I don't know. I feel like I've been moving further and further away from epic fantasy since I've been working on the trilogy. Like obviously the trilogy is like very epic, like it's secondary world fantasy, but I mean, I've just been reading a lot less of it. I'm getting disillusioned with its ability to tell us important things about the world. And I haven't like picked up any new epic fantasies that like really sucked me in. And that's just like my current mood as a reader. Like, you know, like these things shift and change, but I'm a lot more interested currently in like alternate histories, or just like straight historical novels, or in particular like experimental contemporary lit stuff. And I want to try out those genres too. Like I want to write a thriller, I want to write contemporary lit, I want to write something that's like super literary and not like speculative in any way, shape, or form. Although, you know, I think the genre distinctions between literary and like sci-fi fantasy are not real. But, you know, I want to write something that's like more mainstream, like literary stuff. But we'll see. I really just like, I want to try out every genre at some point throughout my career, because except for romance, I don't think I will ever be able to write a good romance book. But I mean, I might circle back to epic fantasy at some point if I start getting excited about it again. But right now, that's really not what I'm reading and not like where my head is. So we'll see.
Is the Oxford novel like going to be like sci-fi fantasy, or not at all?
It has speculative elements. So the magic system, obviously, like, since there's a magic system, it is fantasy, but I'd call it more like alternate history with some fantasy rather than like a proper fantasy novel.
Gotcha, that makes sense. Okay, so moving on to the next question, which is about the military strategy and also like your previous experience in debate. So those were definitely my favorite scenes in the book. I love Master Irja's classes. I love reading about just all the different strategies that they learned. So how did really your experience within either debate or your history major help develop these logical puzzles and military tactics in the book?
So I don't think my debate experience really helped me develop military tactics. One thing that my debate experience did help me with is, you know how in the first book when they're fighting in the rings and then there's the tournament at the end of their first year that's like part of their exams, like that's all lifted straight from debate tournaments, right? So like prelim debates and then elimination rounds with like, the bracket where everybody comes to watch. Like I just like pulled that format like exactly and made it martial arts rounds instead. But as for like the military tactics and strategy stuff, so that comes from a couple of different places. The first is every Chinese kid is going to be familiar with this, with the Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Zhuge Liang and all his stratagems, right? And so like things like, so in the Dragon Republic, there's this point where actually no, that's in the Burning God. It happens in the Burning God, but they talk about it in the Poppy War. There's this issue with like not having enough arrows, and they're like, how are we going to get more arrows? So they decide to fill a boat with corpses or puppets or something and send it down the river, and their enemy shoots at it, and they collect the boat afterwards, and that's how they get arrows to refill their quivers. And they do this in the Burning God, and it's gross because they need bullets, and they're like, they have binoculars, so we can't just use like straw puppets. Like we need to use actual real corpses, and then they end up like digging bullets out of the corpses. So thank you, Zhuge Liang, for that. Um, but then a lot of people ask me like, "Ooh, you must be really good at strategy because of all of these like military like encounters that you described so vividly." And the answer to that is I cheated. I just read about military campaigns in Chinese history and like directly lifted those strategies and adapted them to the plot lines. So I read a lot of books detailing the like back and forth campaigns during the Chinese Civil War, and like even some of the names of the battles and the names of the cities where they are fought, like they are put directly into the Burning God. But and the Battle of Red Cliffs like is so famous in Chinese mythology and literature. But yeah, all like the big stratagems and gambits, etc. That's all lifted straight from history or from mythology. So really can't claim credit there, but I can credit my research skills.
Your research skills are amazing. I think you're the one who brings it all together. That was really fantastic to read about.
So it was fun to write because a lot of the tactics from the Chinese Civil War, right, are from the 20th century. So they have guns and they have, machine guns and all this modern military technology that the characters in the Poppy War do not have. So I had to think really hard about how do I adapt this to a world where they're fighting with like swords and arrows, etc. But taking, for example, the principles of guerrilla warfare, of which there is a lot of literature about, especially like during the Maoist period, and adapting them to Rin and her army, I think that was some of the most fun I had when drafting The Burning God.
That makes sense. So the Poppy War trilogy is also largely based on like Chinese and Taiwanese history, but readers from across the world have talked about how they really felt seen because you really discuss the cycles of violence and the aftermath of war. How has really been the reception of the Poppy War in other countries where the book has been sold?
So here's the interesting thing. The Poppy War actually has not sold rights in any Asian countries except for Korea very recently, or South Korea rather. But and I suspect I know why, which is that the Poppy War is like a groundbreaking book in the US or the UK, where we don't have a lot of Asian inspired fantasy, or we don't have a lot of media that talks about the Second Sino-Japanese War, where for a lot of people this is their first encounter with that mythology, that culture, or that history. But that's absolutely not the case in China. All of the mythology and the source stories that I'm drawing from in the poppy war, like there are like blockbuster movies being made about all the time. There are animes, there are web novels, or not like the Chinese version of anime. There are web novels, there are animated shows, there are dramas that, have characters from the Investiture of the Gods, that have characters from Journey to the West. So that's not new for them. The market is completely saturated with the stories that I'm working with. And as for the topic of the Second Sino-Japanese War, like I grew up with my dad, like obsessively watching these military dramas, right? Like I can think of dozens and dozens of dramas about, Chinese peasants fighting the Japanese. Like that's a really familiar story in China. So the poppy war is nothing new there. And I think this is a bit similar to the reception of a movie like Crazy Rich Asians in China versus in the West, because Crazy Rich Asians is a movie that's made for diaspora Asians. It's made, and the reason why it feels groundbreaking to us is because it's the first time that we've seen somebody that looks like us as the lead in a rom-com, and it's the first time that we've seen like the particular struggle of being diaspora, being raised in the US, having not that good Chinese, like not understanding like the specifics of like culture and how you relate to, older people and how you carry yourself in a lot of social situations, like, and Rachel going back and like being thrown into all of that and feeling ostracized and being made to feel like she's not enough or that she doesn't understand this world, etc. Like that's something that a lot of diaspora people can get on board with. But it flopped in Asia because Asians were like, yeah, of course, like the movies that we make, the rom-coms that we make, like star Asians, like we're super used to this. Like Crazy Rich Asians is nothing new, and it's true. And in a similar way, the poppy war is written by a diaspora Chinese person for diaspora Chinese readers. It's written in English. It was written specifically for a Western audience, which is why I feel totally fine, right? That it's probably never going to take off in Asia, but that's because they don't need that story, but we need that story in the West.
Yeah. When you say we need that story, I was like, I really did need that story. Reading that, I was talking with my friends, and it was one of like, I felt so proud to be Asian after reading The Poppy War.
Well, I don't want to make it sound like, oh my gosh, The Poppy War is like the most groundbreaking Asian novel either, but I do feel like it is part of a trend of a lot of diaspora Asian fantasy novels, and I feel like I've only been seeing more and more come out after I got my deal. So when we sold The Poppy War, like the main authors that I was looking up to, because I really couldn't find a lot else that was out, were Fonda Lee and Ken Liu in the adult fantasy sphere, right? And Cindy Pon in YA. But I could really only think of the four of us. But since then, I feel like a lot of Asian diaspora writers have been getting deals with Big Five publishers. And I think it's happening more so in YA, but like also in adult, like Shelley Parker Chan's book is coming out next year. Andrea Stewart's book is coming out this month, I think. So I mean, it's really great. Like I feel like I feel like we're really dominating the market, and more of us are getting a chance, and that's good. Like I don't want like the Poppy War to be the only book that people can think of when they think Asian fantasy. I want it to be part of this larger wave.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I'm so excited for all the new releases that are about to come out too.
Me too.
So those are all the questions that I personally had, so I wanted to move on more onto fan questions. So the first one is the fuck, marry, kill Rin, Nezha, and Kitay.
Okay. Well, wait, who are the three again?
Rin, Kitay, and Nezha.
Okay. Well, okay, that's very difficult. I kill Nezha. I'd probably marry Kitay, and what's the last one? I'd fuck Rin. But that's easy for me because Kitay is basically like all of his mannerisms and like a lot of his like lines of dialogue are just like lifted straight from my boyfriend. Like as like the series went on, I just like started modeling him off of my boyfriend more and more. So I can very easily imagine myself married to Kitay.
That's so cute. I love to see that. Okay, so the next fan question was, what made you decide to have Altan use a trident as his weapon of choice?
I have to admit, I just thought it looked cool. Like tridents, I think I might have like recently read Hunger Games Catching Fire, and that's when you meet Finnick Odair and he's got a trident, and I was like, damn, that's sexy. So that's why Altan has a trident, and it's also like a unconventional weapon, and he's from an island country, so that's like another thing that like sets him off culturally. But the trident symbolism I had a lot of fun with in the second book in particular, because Rin starts using Altan's trident, and it's so clear that this is a terrible weapon for her because she's very short, right? And this, like, it's Altan's trident, so it's really long and unwieldy, and she has no idea what to do with it. And there's a really significant moment, like near the end of the book, where she finally has the trident melted down to make two swords instead. And that's her being able to let go of Altan's legacy and trying to be like him all the time, and live up to his shadow, and instead forging a destiny for herself. So when I finally got rid of the trident, actually, that's when Rin's story finally properly took off.
That makes sense. That one scene where Nezha was like, "Why are you using the trident? Like you're so much better with the sword." I was like, oh, yes, you're so right.
Oh my goodness, that scene is like so emotionally loaded. Now when I look back on that scene, I think it's super funny because in a lot of conversations in the first part of the Dragon Republic, just like, why is it always about Altan? Can you stop thinking about Altan? I hate this. Like, I'm right here, and Rin's just like, who? What? I don't see you.
Okay.
And it's like, are you really jealous about the weapon, Nezha, or are you jealous about something else?
So true. Okay, so the next main question is, what was your rationale in making Rin dark-skinned when you yourself are light-skinned? And you also have been very vocal about making sure any art or like even the covers of, like, for example, the Indonesian cover has to make sure that it's properly represented.
Right, so I'm pretty light-skinned for a Chinese person, and yet when I went back to Beijing for the first time in a while in 2015, and that was the first time I like really lived in China as an adult since I like immigrated. A lot of people are like, "Wow, you're so dark, like you're so tan. Like, are you mixed? Like, are you from the South? Like, are you?" A lot of like cab drivers would be like, "Are you Chinese Mexican?" And I'd be like, "No, I'm just like, Han Chinese." And like, which is not to say like in any way that I'm dark skinned, but rather the colorism in a place like Beijing is so entrenched and really so scary that unless you're just like paper white, like your skin is seen as not good enough. And I would see all these ads in the subway about like skin bleaching formulas, skin lightening creams, and it's like, that's really sad, right? I would see girls in Beijing walk around with like black parasols on days that weren't even that sunny because they were just so scared of being tanned. And that was my first time really dealing with and thinking about colorism in Asia, because I feel like in diaspora Chinese communities that there's a bit less of that, which is not to say that it's not a problem, but like, especially, and you probably like know more about this being from California, but I think like you see so many super tan Asians in California, and that's just like a lifestyle. That's a fashion, right? Yeah, like tan Cali girls, and that scene is quite beautiful. So because of that, like because I was raised in the West, I didn't see quite how prominent it was in China. And then obviously I started doing a lot more research to understand the roots of this. And this is not a problem that's isolated to Beijing or a problem that's isolated to China, but rather like all throughout Asia. So I wanted to address that with a protagonist who's from the South, who's dark-skinned, who is so dark-skinned that even though she blends in the South, like she's actually from this island country sphere. And I mean, that gets into another issue that I've talked about a bit, but not enough, I think, about the ways in which China and the PRC, which is, China is majority Han Chinese, and people who are not, from Asia seem to have this misconception that, all Chinese people are the same ethnicity, but actually there are quite a lot of ethnic minorities in China, and a lot of them are treated very, very badly. And for example, people will say things like, like the West is always coming after China, but like China really is putting like Muslims, Uyghurs in concentration camps, and like that is a massive, like grotesque human rights violation that nobody's talking about. And so the treatment of the Spearleys in the Poppy War, and also of the Hinterlanders, who really don't like being called the Hinterlanders, they would prefer to be called by their particular clans, and the ways that like the Nakara talk about them and like refer so callously to their history and their ethnicity and backgrounds. I think I wanted to use that to highlight the ways in which, like, even though China was being, or even though like the Nakara were being dominated by the West, like they were in turn being really exploitative and oppressive towards other minority groups.
Yeah, I really love the scene where I think she calls out either Kitay or part of people in the psyche about how they shouldn't be calling them the hinterlanders, but calling them by their specific group name.
Yeah, but the worst part is that, or not the worst part, I guess, like, because that would imply that I didn't write it, but then I have them go right back to using the word hinterlanders after, even though like they're called out on it, because it just like highlights like how little they think of these other groups.
Yeah. So I know we're coming short on time, so I wanted to ask one quick question about Venka's character arc and then do a really quick this or that if we have the time. So did you have like Venka's entire character arc planned out when you started writing?
Actually, Venka was one of the characters who kind of happened. And when I was drafting the Poppy War, I had no idea how important she was going to be in the Dragon Republic and the Burning God. But, you know, her character was like, so I did not imagine her coming back after the end of the Poppy War. When I came up with her, like I knew what was going to happen in chapter 21, and I knew how her relationship with Rin was going to change. But then when I was drafting the Dragon Republic, she originally wasn't in the outline. And then I started thinking like, oh, what happened to Venka? Like, you know, she must be here. This is where she's from. And then you get really important scenes and confrontations between her and Rin because they come from such different backgrounds, but the ways in which they suffer during war are so much the same that they grow closer and closer and are able to overcome their differences. And I don't want to spoil the Burning God, but I think that they have a lot of important encounters in the Burning God that I really, really enjoyed writing. But yeah, she was much more of a discovery character, but I'm glad she happened the way she did.
As much as I love Rin's platonic relationship with Kitay, I love the female friendship with Venka too. Okay.
In another world.
Yeah, in another world. So really quickly, as like a this or that, would you pick Azula versus Rin?
Frankly, I think that Rin would win in a fight. They're both like unhinged, but I think Rin is unhinged for better reasons. And and Azula never sank an island, so.
That's true. They're both very powerful. Fire versus water.
Fire.
Okay. Chalton versus Rinezha.
Charlton, because I've had to write Rin and Nezha for so long that I'm just so annoyed with them. I hate them so much.
Okay.
I don't want to deal with them anymore.
The Poppy War, Dragon Republic, or the Burning God?
Oh, the Burning God. I think it's miles better than either of the first two.
Okay. And then last one, which is very irrelevant, but we love talking about food. Sushi versus KBBQ versus dim sum.
So I'm vegetarian, so I used to really enjoy Korean barbecue, but now all I can have is like mushrooms and kimchi. So I would rank that last. Then, so we were eating fish until this year, but then my boyfriend decided that fish feel pain in a more like significant way, which sucks for me because I really love sushi. So I can't have sushi either, but I can have like veggie like xiaolongbao. So dim sum wins by default.
Okay. And those are all the questions that I had. Thank you so much again for interviewing me or letting me interview you and just joining me today.
Thanks for having me. This was so much fun.
Yeah, I'm so excited for The Burning God. I hope other people are just as excited after this interview, and make sure to pre-order because you want to complete the collection. It's going to be so amazing. Okay.
And look out for cool announcements about certain types of pre-orders in September, but I really can't say more.
So this means there's more than one pre-order incentive.
We'll see.
And then just in case people are wondering, will you be doing like signed copies or personalized copies? Or like a book?
So unfortunately, it seems like Forbidden Planet, which was doing signed copies, they've sold out already. There is another way in which you'll be able to get signed copies, but I can't talk about that yet. And I'm looking into ordering book plaques or bookmarks that I can sign and send out to bookstores, but that's not confirmed yet. But I will tweet about it when it is.
Okay. So yeah, thank you so much again. Best of luck with your classes and everything. So very excited to have you.
And stay safe.